Hey, folks. Okay, testing. Is it frozen? Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello, hello. Yeah. Hey, folks. I am just sending the link as an announcement so that folks join. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I have some allergies. Cool. I hope you folks had a good weekend. A good and restful weekend. We're gonna go ahead and get started. So welcome to week 6. Let me see. I'm like, okay. Cool. So welcome to week 6, y'all. This week the theme is reproduction and fertility and sexuality in art. And I'm excited to start this lecture. I'm going to be making my lectures shorter just because I was feeling like they might be too long. And so look out for that. I also wanted to make an announcement about, so the voting, the extra credit for voting, assignment or extra credit, sorry. So I posted on the announcements 3 options, right? You don't have to do all 3 of them to get extra credit. You just need to do one of them. Okay, so I acknowledge that folks, some folks can't vote, some folks are not eligible to vote, and that's annoying. And so I just want to acknowledge like just different ways. If you are not able to vote, if you don't qualify to vote, you can encourage a friend or a family member, and then submit documentation on that. Or you can do a series of social media posts encouraging your the folks that follow you on social media to vote. And so just to clear that up, yes. So no, you don't have to do all three of them. You choose one option, and then you submit documentation on that. And then for this week, so instead of having a written assignment, you folks will have a multiple choice quiz that you'll submit. So the quiz, I know the word quiz might be like a little bit like, whoa, it's a test, but it's going to have the same weight as an assignment. So just think of it as an assignment, but this time the format is different. It's a multiple choice format. And you can find that under your course materials folder under week 6 materials. You should see quiz 6. And if you can't find it, just let me know through email, but it should be there and it should be pretty accessible and easy to find. So those are a couple of announcements that I wanted to start with for this session, just to keep clearing things up for folks. I also might decide next week or in a few weeks to do a Zoom live, just to see if we can go ahead and create more group discussion through that Zoom platform. But otherwise, yeah, it will mostly be YouTube live, maybe with a couple of sessions on Zoom. Okay, cool. So awesome. And yeah, just a reminder for folks, if you want to type things along the way of something, if something seems exciting to you or interesting to you, you can type comments, a simple word or comments or questions on the chat box. And this makes it be just a little bit more interactive. So let's jump right in. Share screen. Share. Cool. Okay, so welcome to week 6. I also recorded a 5-minute video on voting and how to register to vote, and how to check if you're registered to vote in your county. Some of you folks live in Cameron County. Some of you live in what is it, the Edinburgh Harris County. And so really check what county you live in. But the voting instructions should be there. If you folks have any additional questions, just let me know. But be sure to watch that video on how to register and how to check if you're registered to vote. And then the dates for voter registration in Texas, the deadline is October 5th. So if you register online, you're going to have to print a form and you're going to have to mail it to the local elections office, depending on which county you live in. So, and I put some information on Blackboard too of where you should mail in your application, but the deadline to apply is October 5th. So if you mail it, you need to postmark it before October 5th. And then the dates for early voting are October 13th through the 30th. So that's the early voting. It's coming up so soon, everyone. Like it's coming up like it's going to be next month already. And so I would really make sure that you're registered or that you submit your application on time if you want to register to vote. Yeah, it's coming so quickly. And I think before we know it, we're going to be early voting is going to happen and the polls are going to be open. And but I'm going to keep reminding you every lecture. So let's go ahead and jump into the content. So last week we sort of went through kind of the early peoples, right, and the development of people being able to create fire and tools, and started to create representations of their daily lives and their rituals through art, and then really seeing the development of agriculture, and that really allowing for civilizations to grow, right, and cities to grow. So often, and there are still peoples that are kind of migratory, right, and we talked about migration being so natural, but a lot of what happened before agriculture was developed was hunter gatherer, right, and so really migrating, um, depending on the season, depending on like what was readily available, uh, and what was growing naturally, and what folks were able to hunt, right? All super interesting, because I really want to make sure that you all have like a good base of understanding kind of like also this like human evolution, right? And the development of different groups, right? Different cities, civilizations, and really looking at this globally, right? And so this is the frame that I want you folks to kind of develop, right? Because out of this frame, then you can zoom in, right? If you have a big picture, you can then zoom in to different areas in the world, to different groups, to different cultures and ways of living, um, and uh, and learn more specifics through time, right? So these are some of the factors that influence the growth of civilizations and the growth of cities, and these are directly from your book. So major rivers or bodies of water were necessary for the emergence of civilizations. So you see with Mesopotamia, you see with Egypt, right? Egypt was created along the Nile River. Mesopotamia was in between two bodies of water, two rivers, right? And so really bodies of water are so important in creating just like sustenance and basic necessities for humans to settle somewhere, to create these cities and civilizations, right? Super interesting. And that's why last time I posed the question of, well, what is we have a body of water here. We have the Rio Grande, right? Does the Rio Grande serve, like, do we have access to the Rio Grande to create, to kind of gather that sustenance that close bodies of water um, create for humans, right? And so um, I will still pose that as a question and as a reflection question for you folks. But moving on, farming produced surplus food, which allowed for the development of cities and the division of labor within urban areas. So this you can see, okay, we're developing farming, so people are able to grow food instead of, searching and finding food, right? And gathering food, people were able to grow and create that whole system of agriculture, um, which served to develop cities. Then cities became political, economic, social, cultural, and religious centers. So, for example, if you have a group, and just think small scale, just think like maybe a household, right? Because cada casa es un mundo, like every house is a world, right? How is each home kind of organized, right? So when we have humans settling in one place and they're in a group where, you know whether it's 5 people or 20 people or 1,000 people or more than that, there has to be some sort of organization, right, involved. And you see that groups started creating mostly hierarchies. I feel like the human the hierarchy has not been able to be like dismantled, and that's something that is like, I mean, in some civilizations that are present day, and small, folks have been able to kind of uh, break kind of that hierarchical mold, right? And there are some native tribes that that also have like a different form of organizing that doesn't have to do so much with this like hierarchy, right? But just imagine as the development of cities happened, and agriculture, and being in one place, and houses being built, and food being grown, then we need a whole system of organization, uh, political organization, economic, social, cultural, and then religious, like developing, ritual, religious, beliefs and creation stories. And so, um, and I would say this also as a question, as just a reflection of like, analyze how we are organized in different countries now, and analyze how we're organized in this country, um, the government and the economy, right? What are the and religion, um, and so that's an interesting question to kind of see, these are factors that influence the growth of civilizations. Analyze currently how we are organized as well. um, so trade became important amongst groups of people and between urban centers. So trade was important because if one group produced something that the other group didn't produce, right, then they could trade. So formal religions developed, often with many gods and with rulers as stewards of those gods. So, so we will go a little bit more deeper on religion and deities in the next chapter, but just thinking about, people kind of had to create, like, start creating this, like, making sense of the world, right? And making sense of like, why are humans here, and like what, the purpose and everything. And um what different religions have in common is that kind of origin of like wanting to understand, right? Wanting to understand um existence, right? And each religion or culture having like a creation story, right? um and so uh these new cities as well facilitated this like formal development of like religion, right? Political and social structures emerge with hierarchical governments and sometimes your bureaucracies. Society was organized around class systems with priests, warriors, and the wealthy at the top. So hierarchies were formed. Society was organized by class systems. That's something that we see very clearly now. There's still class systems. Um, Also, when after colonization and when the Europeans colonized the Americas and brought over uh, people, Black people from another continent, right, to become slaves in the New World, quote, the New World, right? Um, they created this caste system. They created this hierarchy caste system where the lighter you were, the more on top you were, and the darker or the Black and the native folks were at the bottom, and then the lighter, more Europeans were on the top. Um, so these are hierarchical systems from history that are still, you can see that there is like this, uh, you can see and analyze the way things are right now and make sense of it, because it's it's trickled down from history, right? Um, and so, yeah, so thinking about our political and social structures currently, and also that's why it's so interesting and important to study history, right? Because then you understand like, oh, this is why things are like this, right? And although there have been movements to resist and to create change, right, we still have a lot of there's still a lot of injustices and racism happening currently, right? Um, so writing developed in some areas too. So just as we developed, imagery and that representing like a form of writing developed, and so that's really important. And so it's like a different way of communicating, right? We have the spoken word, we have the written word, we have art, and these are all ways that we can also archive and document. So the military or warrior class emerged. So when the development of territories happened and cities, then folks needed kind of a military or to protect, right? To protect the land and territory. And like for so much of history is like made up of like peoples colonizing other peoples and taking over land and taking over that person's land, and I'm taking over these people's land, and I'm going to expand my empire, and I'm going to expand. And so you see this as like a thread throughout history. But the thing is that as humans we are capable of so many thoughts and feelings, right? And develop evolving those thoughts and feelings, and we're able to learn from the past and not repeat the past. And so the idea is that we should be able to evolve past these social structures, these old ways of living, right? Independent city states were gradually merged into large empires. So that's what I was saying with the earlier point. And then women were generally made subordinate to men. So, I mean, that's just like a fact. And so when we see current examples uh, of women fighting for rights, right? This goes back a long time. And I'm like, should I go into so because so this goes back to kind of like labor, right? And exploitation of labor, and gender roles. And in many cultures, women were made subordinate to men, were made to stay home, right, and provide. They're the child bearers, the home providers, right, the ones that cook and clean. And you can see this still in the 60s. You can still see this now, right? But it really has to do with labor and exploitation and power. So then we go, just going to take a short pause to see if anyone has any comments. Cool, no comments yet. Okay, so then when we think of reproduction and sexuality, and how it's connected and how it's not connected as well, right? So one of the early pieces that we'll study are based on so fertility, right? For civilizations or for small groups, and really thinking about, reproduction. That's like part of humanity, right? That's part of, I mean, in present day, um, you don't you don't have to in present day you don't have to adhere to these kind of traditional norms, right? It's really our choice now as humans and as women, right? But these are some sculptures. These are some forms carved out of stone that come from Austria and Greece. And they were forms that kind of created based on kind of rituals, right? And spirituality. These were forms that helped uh, fertility. So think about uh, how I mean it's hard to conceive, right? Even in present day, there's a lot of women that have a hard time conceiving, and so these objects were sort of meant to like be spiritual and connected to this like uh, need or pues fertility. And so you see, talking about different creation stories all over the world. The book has examples of kind of fertility and sexuality, right? And how different uh, cultures represent kind of pleasure and sexuality. And so the story of Adam and Eve is kind of interesting to me. And I know we see this in very kind of Christian and Catholic, right? Religions. But this is kind of so this is a painting from Italy and it's a fresco. And you see, and I was really interested and I kind of, so personally, I grew up Catholic, but I don't adhere to a religion currently. I like to study different spiritualities and different kind of religious thoughts, but I like remember studying it briefly when I was young, and I'm sort of coming back to it as an adult, which is really interesting. But just looking at this painting and just looking at the figure, so this is representative of Adam and Eve, right? And looking at the figure on the right and sort of her face and like how much it's like a face of suffering and shame. And then Adam covering up his face, like really shameful, right? And I was like, okay, these figures are part of the origin story of life, right? For some religions, Adam and Eve being like the first two humans on Earth, and then also reading about how Adam's rib. So Eve was essentially created after Adam out of his rib. Um, and then this kind of Adam and Eve representing this like original sin and like disobedience of God. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I'm also wondering how folks, because I know some folks in the class are probably Catholic or Christian or maybe another religion, and so I would be curious to also hear like kind of your thoughts on this origin story. But all these kind of biblical stories, right, are meant to kind of teach a moral or teach kind of a way of living. And what I found interesting about this image in particular, and you can read a little bit more about it in your book, is that there's so much shame at the beginning. And so I was, I, I also connected that to, um, so we often make like a separation between, or we often think of reproduction and like having babies, you know, as normal, but we don't normalize talking about sex and pleasure. And if you have time to look up this book, it's called Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Marie Brown. It's something that I'm reading as well. It's really interesting because kind of the shame and the guilt around sex and pleasure, right, is kind of embedded partly in religion too. Um, uh, you know, some of us have heard Catholic guilt, right? And also some of us understand that like sex education in school is very inspired by or is very driven by like religious beliefs of politicians, right? um, and so instead of kind of acknowledging that sex is also a part of life, right, it's also a natural thing that happens, and also taking, you know, taking that approach, right, instead of, we don't talk about it, we don't see it, we don't hear it, we don't, you know, we don't hear about it, we don't learn about it. But yeah, just something, another point for you folks to kind of reflect on is how you know, sex shaming and so much of it is a taboo in like culture. And really, if we're trying to move towards like a more healthy, open way of living on earth, then this needs to be, it needs to be more central. But just looking at different creation stories, I was also looking at the Maya creation story. And this is another interesting point, is that different cultures and different peoples from different areas, right, develop their own creation stories. And so this is based on Maya, which the corn, maize, is very central to the Mayan creation story. Um, and so I'm going to read a little bit about it with you folks. I'm going to read through it because it's kind of hard. It has many layers. And so it's personally also hard to like remember all the details myself. So the creation story of the Maya. This is an account of the beginning, when all was stillness, silence, and water. There was no light, no land, no plants, no people, and no animals. 6 deities covered in green and blue feathers lay in primordial waters. The framer and the shaper, Tepeo and Quetzal serpent, along with Xipayopok and Xcumocane. These deities helped Heart of Sky, also known as Huracan, created the earth. Their spirit essence and their miraculous power gave the earth its creative energy. Now the land had a heart, and they called it Heart of Earth. So these 6 deities essentially imagined and created the earth, right? And now the heart had an essence, had a heart. To separate the sky from the earth, they planted a tall ceiba tree. So the ceiba tree is a really important symbol for creation in the Maya and other indigenous peoples, making space for all life. The roots penetrated deep into the 9 levels of Maya underworld. The trunk was on the surface of the land, and the branches reached up to 13 levels of the Maya upper world. So think of the tree kind of reaching all these different levels going up. This is land, all these different levels going up, and all these different levels going down. And then animals were created, but the animals did not speak and could not worship. So the deities decided to create humans from mud, but these first humans had no souls and were not good keepers of the days. They destroyed them in a great flood. The deities tried another time and created humans from wood, but the wooden people could not worship either, so they were destroyed. Those that survived are said to have become monkeys in the trees. The sky and earth now existed, but there was no sun and no moon. A vain bird called Seven Macau claimed to be the sun and the moon, but this was not true. Two amazing twins, Hunakshpu and Jabalxbalanque, defeated Seven Macau by shooting him with darts. The hero twins were conceived when their mother, Ekik, spoke to the decapitated head of their father, Hunaupu, who spit on her hand from a cacao tree. Hunaupu has been killed by the lords of Xibalba, the underworld. The hero twins became great ball players, and to bring their father back to life, they challenged the lords of the underworld to a game in Xibalba. The twins were permitted to play the game only after they have survived the dangerous trials set for them in the underworld. Using great skill and cunning, the twins won the ball game, and this allowed their slain father to come back to life as the Mais god. The hero twins left Xisbalba and climbed back up to the surface of the earth. They continued up into the sky, becoming the sun and the moon. Now the sun and the moon were in the sky and illuminated the earth. The deities created the final form of humans beings using white and yellow corn. Corn is the precious substance that ultimately succeeds in producing true and enduring humans. So in the Mayan creation story, humans are made out of corn, which is interesting. When I first learned about these stories, I was like, and then what happened? It was like just a lot. I was like, there was just layers of stories, of story that happened. And it was like a little bit like, oh my gosh, I can't like remember all these details. But you can see that like some cultures have like very intricate, very layered creation stories. Um, and so you can start seeing, right, what different groups started, how they started making sense of their surroundings, of their life, of their existence, right, which is super interesting. So now moving on. So thinking, really trying or thinking of taking on this framework, right? And I know that you hear narratives outside in society. There's a lot of narratives that create hierarchies of religions, right? And in this country, there's this real kind of Christian centrism that happens. So really putting Christianity on a pedestal and every other religion kind of like at the bottom, right? And so this class is like, no, we're not placing religions on a hierarchy. Everyone has their own beliefs and everyone has their religions. And also there's so much overlap also that happens between different belief systems, right? And so acknowledging all these things, and you can see also all the xenophobia, right? All the discrimination against, and historically in this country too, right? Against people with different religious backgrounds. And so in this class, no, we acknowledge that all religions, right? And it's interesting, and it poses, it will, I want to pose that question of like, what would what would change within us if we studied other origin stories and other systems of beliefs around the globe, right? And so I really want to encourage you all. We will talk a little bit about this after the lecture today, but So what are some of the creation stories that you've learned about through your religion, right? Whether it's Christianity, Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism, uh, Muslim faith, Jewish faith, right? And there's just so many more. But if you want to share, what are some stories that you've learned about through your religion? And if you want to type them out on the chat, and then we can discuss afterward. So this is a sculpture from Mali, Africa. And this also is kind of like a representation of this like partnership, but there's obviously like sexuality. There's this like expression of sexuality, right? The left figure is kind of like placing their hand on like what seems to be a penis, right? And then the other hand on like his partner's breast, right? And so there's this okay, there's a couple, because their size is the same, right? It's almost like symmetrical, almost like equal, right? um but you could tell it's a couple. You can tell they have like the sexual relationship based on the figure's placement, right, of the hands. But it's also a very like, again, a very symmetrical, very equal kind of, they're both the same size. And so this is how this culture represented kind of sexuality, right? um, in Mali, Africa. And then we have the moche, which is more of like an early peoples in what's modern day Peru now. So 1000 CE, very early on, making these ceramic kind of vessels, right? And if you Google moche, like sexuality, sculptures or vessels or something, you'll see that there's like a variety more of these figures. And I mean, I'm like so amazed because I'm like, these are so like just bold. Like these are, I don't know if the right word is bold, but they're just like, here it is. And it's almost because it's part of this like kind of vessel, right? Which could have been like this everyday object. Then it could have been kind of like more normalized, right? As just something that was part of life. And so on the left, you see someone, it's kind of like a someone helping a woman give birth, right? So a few folks helping the woman give birth and sort of seeing like the positioning. On the right is like obviously a sexual position. uh, and yeah, I would encourage y'all to like Google more of this, because when I first studied this, I was like, oh my gosh, this was 1000 CE. We're in 2020 CE now, and just feel yeah, all the taboo that's like involved with like sexuality, especially women's sexuality. Like women's sexuality is like, if women are sexual, they're like whores, right? And so we're reminded of this like dynamic, right, of this like virgin whore binary that we learned about earlier, right? But this moche group is like a lot more open. And these I learned also that these might have been like also learning tools for community. um, and yeah, these peoples created these so early on. And that's just an example of, there are some cultures and some ideologies that really just uh, are more open, right, about this, whether versus that the Adam and Eve creation story. And maybe just a little bit more on like, there was more shaming and kind of like censoring around the sexuality part, right? um And then you see representations of marriage in the Aztec Empire. This is from the Codex Mendoza. And these were made to document the lives. Remember, this was like, I think, a little bit after colonization, right? And these were made to make sure to document all the rituals and way of life of the Aztec. And so here you see a couple getting married and like literally tying the knot. You see the knot in the middle. I thought that was really funny. I was like, oh, maybe that's where it comes from. And then we have Hindu tradition, right? This is Krishna. And Krishna is an Indian god or a Hindu god, right? And you see, although it looks like a little bit like Radha is like not about it. I don't know what's happening. But this is kind of an example of kind of just like intimacy, right? And in relationships. One example in the Hindu culture. And then I wrote some of the Hindu gods on the left side. So you can see that some cultures and some religions have different gods, right? So Brahma is the god responsible for the creation of the world and all living things. Vishnu, the god that preserves and protects the universe. Shiva, the god that destroys the universe in order to recreate it. Devi, the goddess that fights to restore Dharma. So Dharma in Hindu ideology is kind of like the cosmic order of things, right? And I relate to this. I relate Dharma right now to, we're feeling like things are really chaotic, right? There's a global pandemic. The federal government did a shitty job on preventing, right? And like keeping people safe. There's been a lot of casualties. The government is unstable because there's a lot of hatred, right? And so that's not the cosmic order. That's not how the universe works. Hate is going against the universe. And so I see, maybe Devi right now, the goddess that fights to restore Dharma, is working really hard to restore this cosmic order of the universe and of nature, because hate, racism, violence is not natural. And Krishna, the god of compassion, tenderness, and love. So Krishna is the one featured in the gouache painting from India. And so Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth and purity. Saraswati. Correct me, anyone, if I didn't pronounce it right. The goddess of learning. So there's different gods, and all of them have like different jobs to kind of like keep the cosmic order and keep kind of life going, right? Which is really beautiful. And then we see kind of this like sensual image of a couple, and this is from Japan from 1788. And this is a relief block print. But you see kind of this like, this representation of, which is a little bit more, you can still see that it's a couple, they're kissing, there's sensuality happening, right? So it's interesting to see kind of different representations of like couples and love and kind of more like sexuality. We don't know if they're in love. So with different cultures. And then these are from France, and you can start seeing, so when you read the book, you'll read more about these two pieces, but on the left, and these are both from the 1800s, 1814 and 1863. But the one on the left, you can see kind of like this very sensual position of this woman, right? She's holding these like feathers, and like look at how she's looking at the viewer, right? There's these like curtains in the background. Um, and she's by herself, right? And then the one on the right is more, a little bit more like her, look at the, just compare the different ways they're looking at the viewer, right? The one on the right was more controversial because of the way she's looking at the viewer and the way like her hand is positioned. Her left hand is positioned, right? Um, and so folks were kind of like, oh, this is controversial because the way she's looking at the viewer is not like with this kind of like submissive kind of like, you know, it's more of like, hey, I'm here, you want to do this or not? And this was perceived more like, oh, she's a prostitute, or she's, we don't use prostitute anymore, we use sex worker because that's a job. But they were all like, back then it was like, whoa, like she's a prostitute, right? And then on the left, this was created by, of course, a male painter, a man. And so we also, the book also does a good job at discussing, kind of pointing out, these are both European examples, right? Pointing out the male gaze, right? These portraits of nudes of women, and we saw the Guerrilla Girls example, right, a couple weeks ago, that most of the nudes are made by men. So they're essentially made with the male gaze. They are made for the male gaze, for the male pleasure. And the fact that they are not with anyone, right? The one on the left, she's by herself. She is single, maybe. She is, so it's like, you know, it is designed by the man, for the man, for the male gaze. And so, and then on the right, you can see that with the figure on the right, the Black woman, right, you can really see the social hierarchy that France had at that time, right? Um, So talking more about the male gaze, right? And just like women's bodies, and women's bodies really being a site of like political, they're political, right? Um, and so this, and just thinking about, you know, present day, all those ads, how many times do you see sports cars, like women in bikinis on sports cars, or let's see, like women in bikinis selling beer, women in bikinis selling, you know? And so really, if that happened, you know, in Europe, or with these paintings, that is still happening with kind of images created by men, for the male gaze, for the consumption and the consumerism of men. And then you see Barbara Kruger, who we talked about a couple weeks ago, I think, as well. She's the artist that created this image that says your body is a battleground, right? This is a 1989 image from Los Angeles. And we really, I mean, when we start to thinking about feminism, and there's different waves of feminism, right? And started early, like 1920s, 1930s, right? And the different waves kind of happening through time, right? So first, like women, kind of more the early ones of like, women deserve, you know, the right to vote, women deserve to own property without the signature of their husband. Um, Women deserve to work, to have a job, to self-sustain, right? Um, Women, and then, you know, more as the waves started like happening through history, thinking about, you know, women and the body, and women, and like, you know, assault, right? And how assault and we talked about this before, I think, also with in a previous presentation or lecture, and kind of assault and rape being like you see in the 70s, pre 70s, even today, like rape even like being discussed as like the definition, right? And really back then also considering that if you're married, if you husband and wife are husband and wife, like considering that the husband cannot rape his wife, right? And just looking at all these issues, I mean, there's so many issues around like feminism, and feminism still continues, right? Because we're not done, and we're not going to be done anytime soon. And so really looking at these artworks and really looking at feminist art also, right? um and so as the waves, you know, continued throughout time, um you know, because so for example, people, women of color or black women were like, hey, your feminism is very white centered, it's very white woman centered. We need an intersectional feminism. We need a feminism that acknowledges privilege. We need a feminism that acknowledges race, socioeconomic status, right? Gender identity, citizenship status. We need a feminism that takes into account all these things. And also we need a feminism that centers brown and black women, because um, that's who are primarily and most affected. Um, and so you see, these are very important scholars, and I took this from an article. But if you're interested in this topic, and if you want to learn more about this topic, um, and if you I mean, if especially if you identify as like a man, right, it's important for you to look at this stuff, especially, you know, you all are a different generation, and we don't want these things to keep getting perpetuated, right? So Kimberly Crenshaw is a scholar of gender and critical race theory who coined the term intersectionality to describe the ways in which different forms of oppression intersect, right? And so looking at that, at how everything intersects, right? And really acknowledging our own privilege, because everyone has privilege as well, right? Um, Judith Butler, who argued that gender and sex are separate and that gender is performative, more of like what we talked about a little bit before about the gender binary, right? And how we insist on gendering everything, male, female, or girl and boy, gender reveal parties. Gender is performative, and gender is fluid, and gender is also another social construct. Um, So Crenshaw and Butler's combined influence would become foundational to the third wave's embrace of the fight for trans rights as a fundamental part of intersectional feminism. So really thinking about trans rights, right? Also thinking about women and feminism, thinking about intersectionality with brown and black women, thinking about queer folks, thinking about trans folks. Um, it's all in this kind of like how feminism is evolving, right? We're looking at all these different things. This is a work from a friend of mine that is based in San Antonio, and he really makes a comment on machismo and just kind of like the outwardly very alpha male kind of performative, um, you know, it's performative and socially constructed, right? Ways that like men express themselves, and like how that's passed down culturally sometimes. Um, and how, yeah, I mean, I would say, and he also uses the, you know, the very vaquero, the very cowboy kind of look, and like queerizes that, right? And really makes a comment on a really strong comment against machismo. um, and I mean, we see it locally too, right? Like uh for us that grew up, you know, around here, and you see it everywhere. You see it everywhere, but because we live here, right? We live here, and we kind of interact and experience things here. Machismo is this like socialized behavior of like men know more, men are stronger, men are, you know, dominate women, right? And we we all know that's not true, but there's still a continuation, right, of that machismo and of that performance, right, that's coming down generations, that is learned, that is a learned behavior, right? And we know that gender, if we know gender is, you know, is just a binary and is a social construct, right? And everyone is performing gender, right? Because also there's some folks that don't identify with gender. There's gender binary folks, right? And so he also did this piece where he made this relief print using his boots. So he like carved this and like stuck it on his boots, and that's how he made the print, which is really cool. It says machismo mata, which is true. I mean, the very critical, the very, like the worst cases of machismo is when men violently and purposely kill women just for being women. And we see feminicidios, right, in Mexico. And we see that in the US as well, right? And machismo and all the kind of narrative and social norms, right, that are revolving around machismo also serve to oppress, right, and ultimately kill women, right? So a very common example that I hear sometimes is like someone will say something and they're just words, and I'm like, no, but your words contribute to a whole culture of misogyny and machismo that work to also justify and work to kill women, right? And so we have to think about that, right? We have to think of all these narratives and all these social norms associated with these things. And so when we think about, I love Alok, and I follow them on Instagram. And if you have Instagram, I just like recommend you follow them. But they are a gender nonconforming writer and performance artist. They have a book called Beyond the Gender Binary. Um, and they're just like an amazing artist and just person that talks about, you know, the kind of debunks this like kind of genderization of everything, right? um Alok identifies as gender nonconforming, so their pronouns are they, right? And I think just how I connect to Alok's work is I've been personally very, and I'm sure there's kind of overlaps in different narratives, right, and different personal stories, but I grew up with a lot of machismo in the family growing up, and so we're to the point where when I was trying to use a hammer, I was really into using like power tools, and I was really into like working outside and building stuff, you know. And those things became very gendered, and I would hear like, oh well, girls don't really do that, and I was like, why? I was like, that doesn't make sense. Until this day, as an artist, I really, as much as I love my digital work, I love getting down and dirty, and like I love like shoveling shit, I love working outside, I love building shit, right? And and so you can imagine like this genderization of things, right, of actions, of like careers, of just like ways of being in the world, right? Because I also personally am in tune with like my feminine and masculine side, and there are also very indigenous belief systems, right? That acknowledge that there is feminine and masculine in each one of us, right? And so I personally feel very in tune with like both sides, right? And so it just works, that gender binary really works to just tell, like really categorize and really como se dice, like really be authoritative of like what people can and what people can't do. And really people are supposed to just like figure out themselves, figure out what their passions are, what they love, and self-determine and be able to just live, right, and exist how they want to exist, right? And so for me, learning about this and ordering a Lux book online is that it really helps me kind of create my own space and really kind of channel like who I am, right? And not let anyone determine my identity or who I am, right? And so each one of you, you know, has to do that. Don't let anyone determine who you are. You figure that out yourself. You have to look internally and figure that out yourself, you know, and like know that you are a unique and special human being, because no one else has that heart and brain that you have, and that's what makes us all kind of a part of this world, right? And that makes it, you know, so much more beautiful that we all exist. um, and so yeah, we all have the right to exist and live like we, you know, be who we are. Just be who we are, be ourselves. um so it's already noon. I like was like, oh, I'm gonna make it shorter, but I just made it a little bit shorter. I'm just gonna see if anyone has any questions. Does anyone have any questions to does anyone have any questions to just end the lecture? I will wait a few seconds or a few minutes to see if anyone has any questions. And then or any comments, anything you want to share. We also had office hours last Friday, and let me know if Friday works for you all, because we only had a few people join, pero yeah, I'm wondering if it was because of the day and the time. It was Friday at 3 p.m. So maybe there's a different day and time that works better for you folks. Yeah, but the only thing that I'm kind of like missing from this so the quiz is based on the reading, Ricardo. So with the lectures, I usually go over a lot of or some of the work in the book, right? But the quizzes will be based on the book. What was I saying before? I forgot what I was saying now. Does anyone have any other questions? I'm kind of a little bit despeinada today. Damn. Yeah, so let me know if Friday or what day works best for group office hours. And I will also consider doing Zoom, the Zoom live instead of YouTube live, so we can have the opportunity to speak and ask questions and dialogue more. But if anyone doesn't have any more questions, I thank you. Thank you for joining me this week. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. This stuff is all very interesting to me. Um, so I hope you enjoy your week. Please ask me. Please reach out if you have any doubts on anything. Yeah, but this week is the quiz. Um, and the following weeks honestly will be the quiz until the end of the semester. um and yeah, thank you all again, and see you next time.